Thank you very much for your contribution. Farrell Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. Can I start by paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Blackpool, North and Cleves for securing this important debate and his continued campaigning on this issue. I also like to thank the Honourable Members for Bristol East, Ashfield, Strangford and South Holland and Deepings. As it's already been said, hearing the personal stories of members does bring to fore and the reality of CF patient sufferers. So I think it's really important. I would like to thank you for sharing those personal stories. Mr. Sharma, as we've heard this afternoon, cystic fibrosis affects over 10,000 people in the UK, with 1 in 25 people being carriers of the CF gene. CF, as we've heard, is a degenerative condition with symptoms often starting in early childhood and getting progressively worse and affecting people's quality of life. Whilst there is no cure, treatments are available to help manage the conditions and reduce the effects, as we've heard this afternoon. Sadly, life expectancy for those living with CF is still shorter than general population. People living with CF are also more susceptible to other conditions, including diabetes, osteoporosis, and liver issues. And despite this, and the debilitating nature of CF, people living with the conditions face complex and discriminatory system when it comes to accessing prescriptions. The system of prescription charges is complex for most people, Mr. Sharma, but for those living with long-term health conditions, it can present multiple challenges. As all members have raised this afternoon, there are several exemptions from prescription charges based on demographics, income, and pre-existing conditions. When it comes to pre-existing conditions, the list of conditions that have an exemption from prescription charges was first set in 1968, as we've heard this afternoon. In the 54 years, then we have seen immeasurable changes in our understanding of long-term conditions and the outcomes of people living with them. Yet, just one addition has been made to that list in that 54 years. Just one addition. This leaves those living with CF in the position of needing to have another long-term condition to be able to access free prescriptions. This two-tiered system is leaving thousands of people with same conditions facing different circumstances. For those living with CF who do have to pay for their prescription, we know the difficulties that they will face. The cost of prescription can put people off taking their medication, as we've heard, the really important medication that they need. With the costs continuing to rise, these fears are only going to get worse. Mr. Sharma, not only does that leave people suffering more than necessary, but also, as set out very eloquently by my friend for Bristol East, in the long term, it will cost the NHS more money and further increase pressure on primary care. At a time when cost of living continues to rise, the government ought to consider what more they can do to support people with these essential costs. Knowing that 1 in 10 people living with CF were given emergency grants by the Cystic Fibrosis Trust to help them fund their medication shows just how serious this problem is. No one should be forced to choose between paying for their prescription or risking their lives. Sadly, we know the financial pressures those with long-term conditions often face. As has been mentioned this afternoon by the member for Strangford, the surveys have shown that 29% of people living with CF are not taking their prescriptions due to financial pressures. Too many people are forced to make dangerous choices that they should not have to. The inequality when it comes to the prescription for those living with CF is clearly a cause for concern and one the Minister needs to look at. In December last year, the Minister, responding to a written question, stated that the government's policy on entitlement to help with prescription charges in England is based on the principle that those who can afford to contribute should do so, while those who are likely to have difficulty paying should be protected. I would be keen to hear from the Minister what weight he has given to the financial difficulties of those living with long-term conditions like CF when establishing his principles. Furthermore, as other honourable members have already pointed out, the medical exemption list for the prescription charges has been updated just once since 1968. One would assume, given the government's levelling up agenda, that this would be a perfect opportunity to bring health policy properly into the 21st century. Therefore, I hope that given the powerful arguments that we've heard this afternoon, that the Minister's position would have progressed from his response to the written question just a few weeks ago. For the Minister to have said that the government has no plans to look again at this, despite the overwhelming changes in our health service since the last 54 years, is frankly slightly baffling. But so, what reassurances can the Minister give those living with CF that this government understands their conditions as it is now, not as it was in 1968? He furthermore suggested that capping charges at £108 a year for those living with long-term conditions through prepayment certificate provided support. This highlights a failure to grasp just how serious the financial pressures of those living with long-term conditions like CF are. Those living with CF are facing an outdated and unfair system which is wholly removed from the world as it is today. So if the government truly believes in levelling up, then it is time for the Minister to look at this issue again. Thank you, Mr. Sharma.